Hello everyone, it's Shirley here. Just thought I'd show you what I'm working on in between finishing up some projects. I started making a 9-patch block from a jelly roll, and the jelly roll was from Moda Fabrics, and it's an Adita sitar jelly roll. The blocks I've made so far measure 6.5 inch unfinished. I use 9.5 inch paper plates to store my projects when I'm working on them. The 9.5 inch plates I just bought at the dollar store or the grocery store. You can get them there. I find them really helpful because I can stack them and put my project pieces on. Also, if I have to put it away, I can just turn the lid upside down, put a couple of elastics on it, put it on my little shelf I have just beside my sewing area here. I can also label it if I want. I usually use freezer paper to label everything, and freezer paper will iron onto this and you can just peel it off when you're done the project. So this is what I've started out with. Those are the blocks I'm going to be making, and I haven't really decided what I'm going to make them into. It'll either be a quilt or a table runner. Hopefully it'll be a quilt. The jelly roll had 2 strips of each color, and these are the pieces that I didn't use. The colors that I used, I tried to pick out the lightest fabrics, and then I used the darkest fabrics on these. The inside square here will finish at 2 inches, and all the other pieces will finish at 2 inches as well. So the first thing I did was I did measure my strips. Now these are the strips that I didn't use. I'll use them probably in the border, or I'll make cornerstones out of them or whatever when I get to that part. I haven't decided exactly the layout I'm going to use on this, but I did pre-starch my jelly roll strips, and I didn't find any shrinkage or anything with them. I measured, and they are about 2 5/8 inches wide width of the fabric. So there are little pinked edges on here. I don't know whether you can see them or not, but when I measured side to side, it's 2 5/8 inches. So I have to compensate for that when I sew my pieces together. After starching everything and pressing everything flat and everything, I picked out some colors, and these are the ones, like I said, that I didn't use. So to go about doing my blocks, I just randomly took my strips. Oh, and before I talk about that, I guess I should tell you that I did pick out a fabric from my stash that coordinated with this, and I did make some 2.5-inch strips from this fabric here, and this will probably be my backing borders or whatever when I come to that. To cut my 2.5-inch strips, I'm going to be using a strip cut ruler. This one is from June Taylor, and it's called the Shape Cut, 2009 copyright June Taylor Inc. This ruler is an acrylic ruler. It has numbers from 0 through to 12 and black lines at every inch. It has little slots to cut every 1/2 inch. When I'm cutting 2.5-inch strips, I use this ruler, and I usually cut my bindings at 2.5 inches. But for this, I'm going to be cutting my strips at 2.5 inches to add a coordinating fabric to add into my little 9-patch. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my 0 marking, and it has these little tiny sort of teardrop shape, and each one of those will be where I'm cutting when I'm cutting my 2.5-inch strips. I'm going to line up one of these black lines on the folded edge of my fabric, making sure that it's lined up nice and straight and that I have enough room to put my rotary cutter in. So the first thing I'm going to do is that zero marking is just a sliver away from the cut edge of my fabric, and this will straighten everything up. I'll take my rotary cutter, and at the zero marking, I'll cut the first strip. The rotary cutter will go right in that line. So I want to cut at 2.5 inches. So I'm going to find my 2-inch mark, and here is my 2.5. So I will cut my strip at 2.5 inches. If I needed to cut more strips, I would just go from the 2.5-inch mark up to the 5-inch mark, the 7.5, and the 10. Remove the little strip off the end, and there I have my 2.5-inch strip. So to start out, like I said, I picked out the darkest colors, and then I picked out some lights, and here is my lightest color that I cut from my yardage. Now, because my strips are not the same width, I'm going to be making strip sets like this, and I'll be sewing the length of the jelly roll strip. Some of them will have dark on each side of a light strip. Then I'll be making some light strip sets, and I'll have light and dark in the center, and then I will be cutting them into 2.5-inch subsections. So I just randomly picked. I just tried to make sure that I didn't have two the same. So here I have my pre-cut, or my strip that I cut from my yardage, and one of the pieces is the jelly roll strip, which has the pinked edges on it. So what I did was I took this, matched up that pinked edge to the cut edge of the strip I cut, and I stitched with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I then pressed it towards the dark. After sewing my strips together, this one is going to measure 2.25 inches from this seam line. Now, if I measure from that seam line over, I have just a slight amount over my 2.25 inch line. So now I want my strips to be accurate. So I placed my 2.25 along that stitching line, and my 4.5-inch mark is along the edge of the strip I cut. So the entire length of the strip, I lined up my 2.25-inch mark with that seam allowance, or that seam line, and I trimmed off the excess. It's such a very little amount, but it's enough that if my stitching isn't really accurate, my blocks aren't going to come out the right size. So now with that excess cut off, I should have an exact 4.5-inch strip. So I have a dark and a light, and I can now put on another dark or another light to come up with my pieces. My strip is the right size. If I'm going to add a jelly roll strip that is wider, which I came out with 2 5/8, I'll call this my dark. I'll line up my cut edges. So this is what it's going to look like when it's finished. And again, I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam along there. So I'll take you to the sewing machine. The foot I have on my sewing machine is a 1/4 inch foot. I'm using my FAF 4.5, and if you can see, there's a little metal bar right there, And that is where I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric so that I get an exact 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now this is just what I do on my machine. Your machine may be different. And I'm using glide thread, and it's a 40 weight. And I'm using a number 12 universal needle. Just going to pull out my threads and put them to the right. So I'm at the sewing machine right now, and I'm going to stitch using that foot just on the edge of the fabric. I'm just laying my strips down just so that they're laying nice and flat. I don't want to stretch anything. Keeping that guide along the cut edge. Now my machine is telling me that it is getting low on bobbin, but I should have enough bobbin thread to finish this whole seam. Just cut my threads there, and then I put them off to the side so they're ready for when I go to do my next stitching. Okay, now I'm going to press my seams. I'll just press that whole strip with a dry iron. And I'm using my little unique creative iron because I have longer seams. And throughout my learning experience dealing with cottons and doing my quilting or my piecing, I found that my biggest error was not measuring and being precise. So I'm going to now just run my water brush that I have the precision piecing solution in, and I'll just run it down that strip, and then I'm going to press my seams towards the dark fabric. When I'm pressing my seams with my fingers, I like to press on a flat surface first, and I'll press those seams out towards that outer fabric. If the dark is in the center, I'll be pressing my seams towards the center strip. Once I have that in place, I'll just press. And now I'm pressing, I'm not pushing with my iron. So once I have that whole strip pressed, this outer section of my strip is going to be wider than the one on the left. So this right one is going to be a little bit wider. So what I'm going to do is take my ruler, and to check my accuracy of this center strip, which should be 2 inches, I'm going to line up my ruler on the edge of that seam line, and I have a perfect 2-inch strip in the center. My outer strip should be 2 1/4 inches. When I line up the ruler on that seam line, I am just a little bit extra. So I'll take my ruler, and again, always use the same ruler. This outside strip should be 2 1/4 inches. So I need to trim off that little bit of excess. The other thing is, I always wondered where I should put the line. Should the line be directly on that seam, or should it be a little bit on this other mark here on the outside of that mark? And I try to line up the black line with that seam, making sure that it is straight and nothing has gone wonky on me. So now for the entire length of the strip, I'll use this. My ruler is set at 2 1/4 inches, and I'm now going to trim off that little tiny bit of excess. And again, it's just a tiny little bit, but that tiny little bit can make your block not come out the right size. So I'll go ahead and do that for the entire length of the strip. Okay, I'm back, and I have all my strip sets done, and I'll be sub-cutting these strips to 2 1/2 inches. And as you can see, I've already done some, so I will only have this amount to work with. And now for my 2 1/2 inch strips, before I go ahead and do anything, I'm going to check and make sure that my strip measures 6 1/2 inches. So I'll place my ruler on, lining up and making sure everything is square. And when I measure it, it is 6 1/2 inches. Each one of my subcuts from my strips are going to be 2 1/2 inches. And what I do is I like to line up my markings on my ruler with that 1 inch, or pardon me, with that 2-inch strip in the center. My 2.5-inch marking should be on my ruler, right on the cut edge of that strip. And so I'll go ahead and subcut all my pieces to 2.5 inches. Once I have a bunch of them cut out, what I did then was just stack them, and then just randomly, because I stitched my strips together randomly, I'm just going to place them together so I have my darks in the corners and my lights in the center. So I have my pieces here, so I'm just going to lay out my pieces. So I'll need strips with different colors. So from my light strips, I'm going to take one of them and place it in the center. And now I'm going to take another dark strip. I don't want it to be the same, so I'm just going to grab one that's totally different and lay it out like that. And I tried to make sure that none of my pieces were the same here and none of my pieces were the same here. I'm now going to be stitching those together. Off to the right here, I've stacked up some blocks that are ready to sew, and I've just laid them out, alternating them in different directions. I've laid this out that I have my darks on the outside and in the center is my dark. I always like to stitch by flipping this one over from the right hand side to the left. That way I know that this is where I'm going to be stitching and I don't get my blocks twisted. So I'm going to put a pin, and I like to pin going from this way to the outer edge, and I'll put a pin at the end here. That way my ends and everything stay squared up. My seams are going to be nesting in the middle. My pin is pointing to where the seam is going to be stitched. I have everything set up. I'm going to make sure my threads are over to the right. I'll place my fabric underneath the sewing machine, and I'm going to start stitching. I'm going to be using a 2.5 stitch length on my sewing machine. I can move my pin out of the way so I'm not going to sew over it. I'll do a couple of stitches in, and then I will do a couple of stitches back, and then come forward, making sure that I keep the edge of the fabric along my little guide on my machine. And right here I'm going to make sure that my seams are nesting. Stop and readjust. Use my pokey tool to hold everything in place. I don't normally sew this slow, but if I sew any faster, the camera shakes. So I'm coming now to the end. I'm going to move my pin out of the way, but it's still holding everything together. And when I get about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of my fabric, I'm just going to do a couple of little back stitches and then stitch right off the end, and I'm going to hold my fabric down there so I don't veer off one way or the other when I come to the end. While my piece is still in the sewing machine, I'll take and just snip off those little beginning threads. Holding the end of my fabric, I'm just going to pull forward, let the threads relax, trim my threads, that way the thread doesn't pop out of the needle. Put those back over to the right, and they're ready for the next stitching. First thing I'll do is I will just set my seams. And again, like I said before, I like to finger press my seams. And these seams I'm going to be pressing open. You can press them to one side, whichever you prefer. So now that's pressed down like that, and I'm going to now take it and use my water brush, making sure that I put a little extra where those seams are joined there. take it back to the cutting mat and just give those another little finger press. And with my dry iron, just make sure that I've got no little folds. And now I'm going to press it open. My pokey tool comes in handy when trying to press those seams open. Take it to my hard surface, finger press it open, and just give it a light brush with my precision piecing liquid. Take it back to the pressing area and press those seams open. I'll turn it over and give it a final, just quick little press from the right side. So now at this point, you can check and make sure that your stitching is correct, and you can measure from your seam line over. So now this one is going to go here. I'm now going to just flip this over and do exactly the same thing as I did before, lining up my cut edges at the top and at the side, placing my pins in so everything lines up. And I'll make sure when I go to the sewing machine that I make sure my seams are nesting. One seam is going this way, one seam is going that way. So we'll flip over to the sewing machine again, and I'll stitch that once more for you. So again, back at the sewing machine, I'll move my pin out of the way. Don't sew over pins. Start stitching. When I get in a little bit, I'll do maybe a couple stitches back and then forward, using my little pokey tool to help me keep everything nice and straight, making sure my seams are nested. I'll use my pokey tool to hold that in place until I get close to it. And making sure my seams are nesting here. I can feel it. I'll hold my pokey tool right there. And you can see I can stitch right close to where my pokey tool is. And stitching off the end. I don't have to move this pin at the end because I've put it in like that and I've kept it away from my seam allowance. I'm going to make sure my pieces line up at the end. Again, at that point where it's about 1/4 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch away from the end of the seam, I'll do a couple of back stitches, holding everything in place so I don't veer off at the end. And I'll just stitch that down. And again, while my fabric is still in the sewing machine, I'll take and clip my threads, raise my needle, pull away a bit, let it relax, snip, and put my threads off to the side. That seam is stitched. I'll remove my pins. And again, we'll go back to the pressing mat. And again, like I did before, I'll flip it over, give my seams a light finger press. I'm just going to give that a press. I'm going to press on a hard surface first. Press to one side first before I press my seams open. Flip it over. Do the water brush again. Now take this back to the cutting mat because I like to just finger press my seams on that flat surface and make sure they're laying nice and flat with no little bubbles on the other side. I'll press that down with the iron, give it a light press from the front, and now we're going to test out our block to see if it's 6.5 inches. I only have one ruler that I use for squaring up my blocks, and it is a 12.5 square ruler from OmniGrid. So now I'm going to test and make sure that my block is measuring 6.5 inches. I have put lines on my ruler where the 6.5 should go, and I'm lining up the edges, and it is exactly 6.5. My outside should measure 2.25 inches from each side, and that center block should be exactly 2 inches. So now the only trimming I will do on this, if I think I need to, is just take and line up my ruler. And again, making sure I don't trim anything else off. I'll just trim up any of those little stray threads. And that's just to make it look pretty for the video. And there I have my 6.5 inch 9 patch. When I'm done with my block, I'll take my paper plate that I have for my blocks, and as you can see, I have all my seams that I've pressed open in the same direction. I might be turning some of my blocks, but I usually like to put them like that. In another video, I will show you how I do a scrappy 9 patch block, and I'll be using a different method. Over the last couple of days, I've been working on my 6.5 inch 9 patch blocks. Once I was confident that my blocks were coming out the right size, that I cut properly, stitched properly, pressed well, without steam, I did chain piece some of my blocks together, and it made the process go through a little quicker. And I managed to put together 47 blocks with the 4 dark corners and the dark in the center. I do have extra of my light center, and I've got some extras here. That's all the extras I had, and a few jelly roll strips that I didn't use, and my backing fabric. And this is my little scrap bin that I put all my scraps in when I'm working on a project. So I put everything into one of these cases here. I'm not sure how this is going to turn out, but I think I have enough squares that I'll be able to make a quilt out of. I won't have to make a table runner. I did cut some 6.5 inch squares from the backing fabric, and I may put it together like this, or I may just use these and incorporate some of these extra strips here. And again, just to let you know, there's no pattern, I just wing it most of the time. So, could I have done anything different? Yes, I probably could have, but I found out if I cut everything accurately and stitched accurately, everything came out to be 6.5 inches, and all my points matched. So the little scraps that I have here, I have a few that I can use, so I'll take those apart. The little scraps will go to my daughter for her junk journal, and the larger scraps, I save those and I use those for my scrappy projects. But I'll leave them in this box for now. I like to label everything, and I have counted out my squares, and I've just wrote it on a piece of freezer paper, ironed it onto my block, so I know that I've got 47 6.5 inch blocks. I've bundled up my strips that I've made, and I've just wrapped it with a piece of freezer paper and ironed it. I've also put everything together like this with a piece of freezer paper wrapped around it. So now what I'm going to do is I'll set this aside. Off camera, I'll go about putting it on my design board and seeing what kind of a placement I can come up with and how I can incorporate these strips into my quilt. So thanks for watching. I hope you found a few little tips here helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.